Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, but not including costs such as shipping. But let's get into this deck. So, Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn, is a 2/2 legendary unicorn with a lifelink, costing 2 generic, a green, and a white mana to cast, and has it so, at the beginning of each end step, if you gained life that turn, you can distribute that many +1/+1 counters among any number of other target creatures, which lays out a pretty clear build path for us. Lathiel is going to want a lot of additional sources of life gain, which we'll mostly look to be getting through lifelink creatures and effects giving life gain upon various permanent types entering the battlefield, though we'll also have a smattering of other life gain effects in this deck. Along with that life gain, we'll be looking to include a few other sources of +1/+1 counters and other combat-specific buffs, be it temporary power and toughness buffs or keyword abilities. And of course, Lathiel's going to need a decent number of other creatures to buff with its counters. But that's enough of a preamble, let's start digging into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. To start, we have a collection of low-drop mana dorks with Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, and Avacyn's Pilgrim for 1-drops, and additionally, we have Gyre Sage, which adds a green mana for each +1/+1 counter on it. Then we have a fistful of mana rocks with Mind Stone and Prismatic Lens tapping for generic, Talisman of Unity tapping for generic, or it can tap for white or green at the cost of pinging ourselves for 1 damage. Felwar Stone is likely to tap for at least one of our colors, and Arcane Signet will tap for whichever color we need at that time. And Selesnya Signet converts 1 mana into a white and a green mana. And finally, Pristine Talisman gives us a source of generic mana and a little bit of life gain. But with that, let's move on and take a look at some of our many sources of life gain. First up, Healer's Hawk and Ruin Lurker Bat are 1-drop 1/1s with flying and lifelink. And then for a bit more mana, we have Perimeter Enforcer and Aerial Responder, also with flying and lifelink, so any of these creatures would be great targets to put Lathiel's counters on. Then Daxos, Blessed by the Sun, and Trostani, Selesnya's Voice, give you life whenever creatures enter the battlefield under your control. Daxos giving you 1 life, but also triggering upon our creatures dying, and Trostani gives you life equal to that creature's toughness. Then we have Soul Warden, Essence Warden, and Soul's Attendant, each of which letting us gain 1 life whenever a creature enters the battlefield, not just under our control. Then Sunscorched Regent has you gain 1 life whenever an opponent casts a spell, while getting larger with +1/+1 counters at the same time. Spike Feeder plays interestingly in this deck as it can convert the +1/+1 counters on it into 2 life, which can be activated at instant speed, and Lathiel turns that 2 life into 2 +1/+1 counters to spread amongst our creatures as we choose. So this card can potentially let us convert all but one of its +1/+1 counters into life on each player's turn, with Lathiel then letting us give Spike Feeder those counters back, or more, to repeat the next turn, while also buffering our other creatures with the remaining +1/+1 counters. Then Heroes Reunion and Feed the Clan are 2-drop instants giving immediate life gain, with Heroes Reunion giving 7 life, and Feed the Clan either giving 5 or 10 life, depending on if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. And since these are instants, we can cast them during an opponent's turn to buff our creatures through Lathiel before our next turn in combat phase. Cleric class makes it so if you would gain life, you gain that much +1 life instead, and can be upgraded to level 2 to make it so whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control. And while I don't regularly put Planeswalkers in my commander decks, Ajani the Great-Hearted fits well into this deck, with a static ability giving our creatures vigilance, and thus making it easier for us to both swing and protect Ajani, and a +1 ability that gives us 3 life, and a -2 ability to buff each of our creatures with a +1/+1 counter. Then we have Felidar Sovereign, which has lifelink and vigilance on a 4/6, but also provides us with an alternate win con, as if we have it and at least 40 life at the beginning of our upkeep, we win the game. And while not life gain, I don't have a great chapter to put this in, but I also have Test of Endurance in this deck, which also gives us an alternate win con like Felidar Sovereign, though it requires you to have 50 life to win in this case. Now I'd like to quickly go over a few cards that can help us up the number of +1/+1 counters on our creatures even further. Pledge of Unity is a one-off spell to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, but we also gain 1 life for each of those creatures, so with Lathiel on the board, we get even more of those counters by our next end step that we can spread amongst our creatures as we wish. Then Good Fortune Unicorn buffs our other creatures on the way in, giving them a +1/+1 counter when they enter the battlefield. Then Conclave Mentor gives an additional +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are being put on a creature we control. Felidar Retreat gives us a couple of options as a landfall effect, either letting you grow your board by making a 2/2 Cat Beast creature token, or you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control and give them vigilance until the end of the turn. And finally, Nykthos Paragon has it so whenever you gain life, you can put that many +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. However, this can only trigger once per turn. But with that, I'd now like to go over some cards that can help make our creatures a bit more potent on the battlefield. To start, we have a handful of cards that give our creatures we control with +1/+1 counters on them additional keywords, such as Einok Bondkin, which gives those creatures first strike, and Abzan Battle Priest, which gives them lifelink. Then Duskshell Crawler and Tuskguard Captain give those creatures trample, and Abzan Falconer gives them flying. Then, coming off of the spells affecting creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, Glorious Sunrise gives us a number of options at the beginning of our combat phase. Either giving our creatures +1/+1 and trample until the end of the turn, letting a land tap for 3 green mana until the end of the turn, drawing a card, provided we have a creature with power 3 or more, or gaining 3 life, which Lathiel could then turn into counters. Champion of Landhold makes it so creatures with power less than it can't block creatures we control, while Champion of Landhold also gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control. And finally for this section, Cultivator of Blades makes it so when it attacks, other attacking creatures get +X/+X until the end of the turn, with X being Cultivator of Blades power. Now let's go over the collection of spells that we can look to use to refill our hands throughout the game. First up, Shamanic Revelation has you draw a card for each creature you control, and you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater, which with Lathiel on the board could lead to a decently large number of counters to spread. Camaraderie gives you X life and has you draw X cards, with X being the number of creatures you control, while also giving them +1/+1 for the turn. Armorcraft Judge has you draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it when it enters the battlefield. And similarly, Inspiring Call has you draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Though note that if you aren't super pressed for the draw at the time and have the mana to spare, this card can also be used to protect our board, as the creatures we control with +1/+1 counters on them also gain Indestructible for the turn. Then Deepwood Denizen has an activated ability costing upwards of 5 generic and a green to draw a card, but that cost can be brought down to just 1 green mana, as the ability costs 1 less generic for each +1/+1 counter on creatures we control. Dusk Legion Duelist lets you draw a card whenever +1/+1 counters are put on it, though it only triggers once per turn. Then Sixth Sense is an aura that lets you draw when the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player. Kudzil, Malamet Exemplar, lets you draw when one or more of your creatures with power greater than its base power deals combat damage to a player, while preventing our opponents from casting spells during our turn. And Lynor, Autumn Sovereign, lets you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control at the beginning of our combat phase, and then we draw a card if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers. Then Colossal Majesty has us draw at the beginning of our upkeep if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. Lifecrafter's Bestiary has you scry 1 at the beginning of our upkeep, but whenever we cast a creature spell, we can pay 1 additional green mana to draw a card. Cosmos Elixir, which has you draw a card at the start of your end step if your life total is higher than your starting life total. Otherwise, you gain 2 life. And Will of Lost Dreams has it so you can pay X whenever you gain life, with X being less than or equal to the amount of life gained. And, if paid, it lets you draw X cards. But now let's take a look at some of the cards that we can use to interact with what our opponents are doing. First up, Sanctify lets us destroy a target artifact or enchantment while also giving us 3 life. Generous Gift and Stroke of Midnight let us destroy a target permanent, the latter with only non-lands, though that permanent's controller makes a 3/3 elephant or a 1/1 human creature token, respectively. Then Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile let us exile a target creature, though that creature's controller gains life equal to its power or can tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, respectively. Stew the Conies lets you have a target creature you control deal damage equal to its power to a target creature we don't control, which could be useful to selectively remove a creature once we've buffed one of ours. And in addition, we make a food token as another potential source of life gain. Cankerbloom is a creature that can be sacked to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, or given that we're looking to have a bunch of creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, we may also wish to proliferate. Then for some board wipes, Austere Command lets us decide what we wipe, choosing 2 among either destroying all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. Azura's Predation is a bit of a one-sided board wipe for lower toughness creatures, as we make a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast creature token for each creature controlled by our opponents, then each of those beasts fights a different one of those creatures. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's take a look at our land base. I'll start with our land tutor lands, with Promising Vein and Shire Terrace tapping for generic, but can also be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. And Myriad Landscape and Crozen Verge also tap for generic, but can be sacked to tutor 2 lands onto the battlefield tapped. Myriad Landscape gets 2 basics of the same type, and Crozen Verge gets a forest and a plains card, though those aren't necessarily basic. Then Broker's Hideout and Cabaret Courtyard are immediately sacked upon entering the battlefield, letting us tutor a basic forest or plains onto the battlefield tapped, but also having us gain 1 life. And for more life gain, Radiant Fountain and Kabira Crossroads give you 2 life upon entering the battlefield. Great Pell Refuge and Blossoming Sands give you 1 life upon entering the battlefield, but also tap for green or white mana. While Blighted Steppe can be sacked to gain 2 life for each creature you control, and Sapseed Forest can be used throughout the game as a small source of life gain. And then we have some dual lands with Fortified Village, a Reveal land, Sungrass Prairie, a Filter land turning 1 mana into a green and a white mana, Temple of Plenty, a Scry land, and Selesnya Sanctuary, a bounce land. Then Path of Ancestry and Command Tower will also tap for white and green as needed. Gavany Township lets us put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control as an activated ability, while Rogue's Passage can help us ensure that one of our creatures makes it through to deal combat damage to a player. Bonder's Enclave and War Room give us a couple extra sources of draw. And then we'll fill the rest of this deck with 7 basic plains and 6 basic forests. And now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing just under $44.50 at the time of recording, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this price won't include things like shipping. And before I close out this video, I'd like to suggest a handful of cards that you may wish to consider if you're wanting to build this deck with a slightly higher budget. Voice of the Blessed is a 2/2 that gains a +1/+1 counter whenever you gain life, and then if it has 4 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it gains Flying and Vigilance, and with 10 or more +1/+1 counters, it gains Indestructible, so this is a great creature to pile Lathiel's counters on. And Call Me of Whispered Hopes is a mana dork that can also ramp the number of +1/+1 counters we put on our creatures. Fracturing Gust is an additional board wipe that has us destroy all artifacts and enchantments, but we also gain 2 life for each permanent destroyed that way. Beacon of Immortality can give you an immense amount of life in one go depending on how much life you already had when casting, and thus can also be a source of a huge amount of counters through Lathiel. True Conviction can really ramp up our life gain through combat, as it gives all of our creatures double strike and lifelink. Damning Verdict is likely the best board wipe we could ask for in this deck, as it destroys creatures without counters on them. And for a couple of other lands, Karn's Bastion gives us a consistent source of Proliferate to up our counters, and Minas Tirith gives us an additional source of draw with reasonably easy requirements to meet. But with that, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, maybe consider giving it a like, and consider hitting that sub button if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feed. But regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.